Welcome to Connecting the Dots, Education, Housing, and Place. I'm Tanya Johnson, Grants Coordinator for the City of Memphis, Division in Housing and Community Development, and I have the honor of introducing the panelists for this exciting session. First, we have Ms. Jamilika Burke, Chief Strategy and Impact Officer with Seeding Success. Currently, she works to create strategic opportunities for collective impact in order to drive system-level change in the cradle to career curriculum with Seeding Success. Welcome, Ms. Burke. Ms. Roshan Austin is the President and CEO of The Works, a 21-year-old community development corporation. The Works, Inc. is the developer of single-family and multi-family properties in distressed neighborhoods. The Work, Inc. is also the sponsor of an elementary charter school, runs a farmer's market and green grocer, provides nutritional education, operates a mortgage loan fund, and does work around the comprehensive needs of community and families. Welcome, Ms. Austin. Ann Jordan is a program director of Enterprise Community Partners, a national affordable housing nonprofit with a mission to make home and community places of pride, power and belonging, and platforms for resilience and upward mobility for all. Welcome, Ms. Jordan. And lastly, we have Mr. Austin Harrison, who will also serve as our moderator for this session. Austin is a visiting assistant professor of urban studies at Rhodes College. His research includes neighborhood change, community development, urban policy, and shrinking cities. He also serves as a research fellow for Innovate Memphis. Welcome from the City of Memphis.
Thank you, Ms. Tanya. And before we turn it over to Roshan to get us started, I think the City of Memphis has a brief video that's going to go really frame up this discussion really well. So we're going to play that real quick, and then we'll hear from Roshan and get the session going.
It was a steady stream of customers in and out of Kroger on Lamar Avenue Wednesday, but next month, this store is closing its doors.
A little sad. We've got a lot of memories here.
In its absence, what is the community going to do to be able to fill that void?
I say almost walking distance from here, just outside of walking distance. But now it's going to be almost impossible if you don't own a car like I don't to go and get groceries.
It does feel like a food desert when you're standing over here in the middle of a parking lot that used to be filled with customers, and whether they be in vehicles or they walk from the neighboring community. I can refer back to a quote that was in an article I read that health was determined by your zip code and not by your genetic code.
When I was driving out here, I just noticed that there weren't any grocery stores, there weren't any fresh produce anywhere. That was kind of a shocker to me. To see the lack of infrastructure, or even the lack of interest in infrastructure in these parts of town, is pretty shocking. You know, the convenience stores started switching to low nutrient food staples because they had high shelf lives on them. And pretty soon, all forms of produce, anything healthy, really disappeared, and it was all prepackaged, processed, high salt, high sugar foods that weren't providing any sort of benefit. You know, people were losing. They weren't just losing their healthy foods; they were also losing a connection. You know, kids, later generations, weren't being exposed to fresh fruits and vegetables, not just Memphis, but across the nation. There are too many people in this neighborhood and in this city who are starving on full stomachs. You know, the corner stores only go so far. You know, there might be some dense proteins like nuts that they could get there, but beyond that, you know, there's no leafy greens, there's no fruits, there's no root vegetables, no dairy products, no eggs, no nothing. Not like it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. They used to be full-service convenience stores where people could buy whatever they needed. And now there's huge avoidable healthcare crises that couldn't be solved overnight, but they could definitely be solved in a generation by just exposing people to the fresh fruits and vegetables that, you know, people of means have access to. You know, the stuff that we're growing out here, we're growing, you know, tomatoes and okra, and we grow collard greens and turnips and, you know, stuff that's traditionally associated with soul food. So yeah, they were gone before 9. The okra was gone before 9. I mean, I came with a full one of these of eggplant, gone. If we start with the kids, we're gonna help people realize, we're gonna help people reconnect with the food that they probably ate when they were kids.
Change gonna come. Oh, yes, you will. Thank you.
You ready for me, Austin?
Go
Good
ahead.
morning,
Yeah,
everyone, and thank you for joining us. Every time I watch those videos, and I've watched them a lot, they just prick my heart. I get teary-eyed, and I had known Theo and the work they're doing at Knowledge Quest because they're our partners in food work in South Memphis. But our session today is about connecting the dots, education, housing, and place. And kind of wanted to share how the works has fit into that space over our time. Pretty early on in the introduction, Tanya mentioned that we are also the sponsor of a charter school. And so we recognized pretty early on in our work that we needed to address families from cradle to end of life. We don't do the workforce development work with our families. We do some things that may be helpful in that area, but we are particularly interested in families throughout their life cycle. And because in distressed neighborhoods, you have a significant number of seniors in the population, we have some focus on senior populations. And also another sad fact about the zip code that we are known for working in most, 38106, it has the lowest life expectancy in Shelby County. I always mention that because I don't think people recognize that, and it's a difference of 14 years. But I'll get to the point in terms of what we've done around connecting the dots as a developer of affordable housing. Beyond what we've done in single family detached in South Memphis, near where our charter school is located inside of St. Andrew AME Church, most recently we completed a anchor-based strategy or around educational institutions in the Fraser neighborhood, a multifamily development for very low income families in Memphis. And those families have incomes that are less than 60% of the area's median. And so for people that are not into those HUD numbers, that, you know, our average family is probably making less than $30,000 a year. And many are at 30%. So they may be making less than $15,000 a year. And they probably have some benefit of a voucher of some sort from some agency, whether it's the housing authority or another agency that provides housing vouchers to help them pay their rent, because we don't charge more than a third. We were actually brought into the project in Fraser because of our experience in doing low income housing tax credits, which is another fact that people don't know, that across the country, since 1986, when the program was established by the U.S. Treasury, low-income housing tax credits account for properties account for about 80% of the affordable housing developments that are happening across the country. In Memphis, we spend a lot of time in our field working on single-family detached, but it's not the number of units that are really going to get at the problem, the root problem of this crisis in affordable housing. And so, and then it also doesn't really speak to families that are 60% and below the median. Certainly, we always use the tag that a mortgage is cheaper than rent, but a mortgage is not just the only thing about homeownership. People have to have enough resources to care for their lawn and do all of the maintenance that is required in a home. They don't have a maintenance team that comes out and does it for you. And so, although we would love for everyone to be able to build some wealth through home ownership, everyone's not there today because we have two different realities. We say that a quarter of the people in Memphis and Shelby County live at or below the poverty level. And then we speak about homeownership as our solution for affordable housing. One thing we do some cycling through neighborhoods, but I think about where schools are located. As the anchor institutions in many distressed neighborhoods that are stressed today, they were not necessarily distressed 5 decades ago. And what we say in these neighborhoods, and you think about the most affluent areas where they have schools that people are fighting to get into, they don't have the vacancy and blight that we see in neighborhoods. We're working in one neighborhood now where there are only 600 households, but there are 1,200 parcels available for residential. And so that already tells you that half of the households that could be in that neighborhood are not there today. They may have been there 5 decades ago or 4 decades ago. And so what that says is there are not enough families with children to really occupy that space, or a school space, because most of the people I mentioned have aged in place, and so they are not of childbearing years. But what we know is that the housing stability, and if we think about our own personal budgets, housing is probably the most we spend in our budget every month. So we look at, I like to say, the top 5: housing, transportation, food, and depending on your household, medicine or childcare for young children that are daycare age or childcare center age. And so if we don't address the housing stability for a population that lives at or below 80% of the median, then we can't really address the school issue that we continue to have conversations about, because we need to build not the school and they will come, but we need to build neighborhoods so that the people are already in place to occupy the schools and other institutions throughout the neighborhood, including the retailers that will come after you have the rooftops and not before. And I'll stop for a moment so we can have time for everybody else.
That's great. That's really great, Roshan. And just to share a little bit about the method behind our madness here, we wanted Roshan to lead us off, because when we're having discussions around housing, education, place, it's oftentimes filled with a lot of jargon and alphabet soup and acronyms. It can be hard to see what does this look like in practice. And so I think starting off with Roshan allows us to begin the session by saying, this is what it looks like in practice, building those households, building back neighborhoods, and then using that work and that practice to create a conversation around scaling up connections between the housing world, the education world, and sort of the place-based world. Like our video at the top started with food access, right? Thinking about those 3 very interconnected pieces, especially in the context of economic mobility, which is where we will go next. So our next 2 speakers, just to let our attendees know kind of where we're going. We'll first hear from Jamila Burke and from Seeding Success. She will discuss the Place Matters group, which Place Matters work, which seeks to scale up all of these connections that Roshan and other community-based organizations are making at the neighborhood level. And then we'll hear from Ann Jordan, who will zoom us all the way nationally with the work at Enterprise, which will allow us to see some of those best practices and what other cities are doing around these same issues. And then we'll love to hear from you, and we'll have at least 10 to 15 minutes, hopefully, to have a brief Q&A with all 3 of our amazing panelists, and we'll wrap it up from there. So I'll toss it over to Jamila, and look forward to hearing more about Seeding Success's work.
Thank you so much, Austin. And here I come with all the jargon. But I really appreciate the way that this conversation is being framed today, to really think about the intersectionality of the systems that are impacting our families and our children. Because as we know, we even look at education, it is majority out of school factors that are truly impacting them and their abilities to advance. And a lot of this conversation about connecting the dots is really what we come together collaboratively to do. So at Seeding Success, we are a backbone organization within the Strive Network. And what we strive to do is really bring together diverse partners from when you think about your parents and youth, but also thinking about nonprofits, areas of expertise, sector leaders, business, government officials, How do you start to bring these different perspectives and backgrounds together to really have dialogue and discussion around the systemic issues that are impacting our families and our community? So a large part of our work is really about how do we bring those ideas together? How do we bring data and research together to inform our decisions? How do we really build it out in a way to where it's being inclusive of those who are impacted? And so over the iteration of time since we have launched in 2013, we initially started off in education, partnering with our school system, partnering with our out-of-school partners to really think through how can we help to build that bridge between what's happening in the school day and what's happening outside of the school. As we continued in that work, what we also saw within that was housing was one of those critical factors that was impacting our families here. And so through a lot of partnership and work over the last 2-3 years, we've been able to do some modeling around how can we look at if we're able to improve the areas around the school, what impact will that have on the families and the students that are a part of that school? And I like the way Rashawn put it, them being the hub, especially in many of our distressed areas. How can we use that as an opportunity to ensure we're able to connect them to resources, health, mental health, opportunities for economic development when you're thinking about job training, information sharing, and having someone that can work hand in hand with our families to ensure that those things are taking place. So a large part of what we've been working towards doing with our partners is really how do you build out that system of care at scale? And so what has happened recently with Place Matters Memphis is through a generous investment from Blue Meridian Partners, which is a national philanthropic organization that works towards eradicating poverty, or what we like to say here is we're working to build wealth, especially for our Black and Brown families. What would it look like to come into a community and work alongside that community to have this dialogue, build out the strategies and the plans that are necessary to do this at scale? As many say in our communities that we also have planning fatigue. For decades, we have brought people together, made plans, had discussions, and then sometimes there are pieces that were implemented. Sometimes it wasn't implemented. Sometimes it was a resource issue in terms of having the investments at the table to do it. But there's one thing that has been exciting about Memphis. There has always been this eagerness and excitement about we want Memphis to reach its full potential and be the greatest place that it can be. So with this work with Blue Meridian and Partners, what we've been able to do is now start a process of really working with a set of partners that have been selected by the community to think through how do we do this well? How do we do it differently? And what are those outcomes that we're going to be looking at to know that we have improved mobility for our families? So over the last 10 months now, we've been convening partners just to have these discussions around how can we govern a process to where it is inclusive, we have buy-in and input from our community, is led by those who are most impacted by the systems that we're looking to change. But we're also creating a place where different perspectives and dialogue can take place. As you can imagine, in building out work like that at scale, it comes with its challenges. It's messy. Collaboration is not easy, and it's not meant to be, because if it was easy, we were doing it all wrong from the beginning. But through these discussions, what we've been able to really see and bring through is that now you have what you may consider your grass tops that are now learning from those who are most impacted. And those who are most impacted are understanding, well, why all these barriers exist to why they can't make those connections. So there have been great dialogue taking place within these conversations to really think through strategically, if we're going to scale this and do this across our community, these are the things that must be true. So through this work, to build on some of the exciting work that's already taken place, as there's been a lot of work around housing, there's been a lot of great work about health and mental health. But now, how do you start to connect the dots to all the great work that's taking place in our community, really understanding who's doing what, building out a table or multiple tables to where this type of discussion for focused area conversation can take place, but also cross-sector conversation can take place because it all is intertwined together. So through this work, the partners at the table have identified 6 focus areas. And within those 6 focus areas, we're developing work groups that will be inviting more of the community to join to where they can help inform what those strategies will be. And those areas of focus are education and youth development, health and well-being, which includes physical and mental health, community development, which covers a lot of what we're discussing today, economic development, which overlaps with a lot of the things we're talking about today, justice and safety in terms of removing barriers to what's impacting our families. And also one that was really interesting that the group talked about was also culture. Memphis has such a rich music and art background and history, but it has not always been looked at as an economic driver to mobility in our community. And what they're looking to do is how can we look at the things that are taking place in our community to start scaling and building in those areas. And with this initiative, it's really led by local talent, local expertise, with some national TA and technical assistants that will be coming in to support and build capacity and capabilities of those who will be leading the work on the ground. So that many individuals that are on this call, leaders in our community that are already doing great work in this area, sometimes we just need that extra boost, not just in investments, but also in technical assistance training and technical assistance to ensure that we're able to really build something that's not just a one-time plan, but it's sustainable for the long term. Because we're really looking at the horizon. If you're looking at mobility, you're looking at generational change. So how can we now start to bring all those pieces together in an effective and cohesive way to we're able to move the needle in those areas? So I will pause right there for right now. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much, Jamelica. That's really helpful. And then the last piece to this really awesome housing, education, and place stool we're creating here. I'd love to toss it over to Ann Jordan from Enterprise to tell us a little bit about what Memphis can learn from other cities. Obviously, we're not the only city that's facing a lot of these problems. And then also what some of those early lessons we're learning from the Memphis work as well. So Ann.
Great, thank you. The joy and challenge of being third in a stacked panel here. So I have some slides to help me compete here. Hope you can see them all. Let me know if you can't. As Tanya mentioned earlier, I work with Enterprise Community Partners, which is a national nonprofit. We focus on making home and community places of pride, power, and belonging, and platforms for resilience and upward mobility for all. What does all of that mean? It means pretty much if you name something related to affordable housing and community development, I can point to somebody at Enterprise who is immersed in it, from developing and deploying programs to advocating for policy to financing the development of affordable housing to owning and operating and providing resident services. One of our keystone initiatives is around economic mobility. And through that, we've partnered with Strive Together to explore ways in which housing can be an effective pathway to advance economic mobility through cradle to career education partnerships. And so far, we've worked with about 7 communities, one of the very first of which was Memphis, and particularly Seeding Success, as well as the city, the Housing Authority, Urban Strategies, and others along the way to support local efforts to build housing and education collaboratives. So today I'll share some of the learnings that have emerged from this work to date. You'll definitely hear some familiar tones with what has already come up, because some of the best practice is really happening here in terms of what it really looks like to scale housing and education partnership. So just a little more, I think also some similar themes on why we've focused on housing and education as kind of that intersection. And for us, it really comes down to how housing and education systems have perpetuated racial and economic disparities. We've seen how deliberate physical and economic segregation of people of color has created high rates of residential and educational segregation. And that concentration of poverty then inhibits neighborhood investment, leading to poor quality housing and under-resourced schools, creating really harmful cycles. But on the other hand, we know that housing and education can be important foundations for future success that underpin many aspects of mobility from poverty. For example, research has shown that housing stability in childhood directly impacts education experiences and future economic well-being, from graduation rates to post-secondary enrollment to employment after that. But the housing and education systems weren't designed to work together. So we set out to figure out a little bit more how we could overcome those barriers by partnering with researchers and place-based organizations around the country. And we now offer technical assistance and other resources to lift up some of those learnings, like today. So to say a little more about some of those systemic gaps that have already been lifted up on our panel and that we have seen time and again from community to community that prevent these kind of partnerships from happening in the first place, some of it comes down to the fundamentals of how these sectors operate. For instance, public education is treated as a public good, while housing is considered a market-based commodity that is not guaranteed for everybody. Housers and educators are also often thinking about different scales of impact. Schools, by definition, tend to focus on their school district or catchment area, while housers tend to be focused at the neighborhood level or building level. And overall, the housing sector is much more decentralized than the education system, receiving funds from different levels of government and more varied actors and owners, which all come with a host of different regulatory frameworks, which can make it really hard to figure out what's the right access point for building these kind of partnerships. So as a result, the partnerships that do exist tend to focus on shorter term or more confined interventions. And that is super important, but it can't stop there. There is such opportunity at the systems level to really disrupt those harmful patterns of residential and educational segregation, to address disparities in outcomes that are rooted in housing issues. But this requires strategic partnerships. And by this, I don't just mean each sector coming up with their own strategy and then coming to each other, hoping that they can get on board, but actually coming up with strategies together, just like Jamilika has been talking about with Place Matters. So here are a couple key characteristics that we've observed in our work at Enterprise around what partnerships are really able to sustain systems change across the housing and education sectors, and really across sectors generally. And it comes down to, one, this ability to assess existing conditions through a cross-sector lens, really to identify barriers and opportunities for action, a commitment to sharing power across different kinds of partners, prioritizing people who are most impacted as decision makers. As you can see, these themes are already really heavily coming up in this panel, which it shows just the progress that's being made in Memphis already on these fronts. And using all that information to create clear and shared outcomes that not only level set across the different partners involved, but can really be used to sustain and spur momentum, identifying opportunities for partnership and interdependencies, while also providing a baseline to track impact against. But all of that doesn't go very far if there's not actual capacity to implement solutions, or at least build the partnerships necessary for implementation. Generally, this means having a clear entity who is leading and coordinating implementation, in addition to clear structures for advisory, operations, data, maybe policy support, and there may be other solution-specific capacities that come up as needed. And finally, one of the hardest pieces is really ongoing resources, as well as commitments with accountability to those shared outcomes for the cross-sector work. And I'll share an example in just a moment honestly, all of the examples I share will get at this in some way, but in particular about overcoming that funding barrier, particularly because the ways most entities in the housing and education sectors are funded are generally pretty distinct and don't often offer the flexibility for cross-sector partnership. But that's increasingly changing, particularly in the philanthropic and increasingly in the public sector. So as promised, I'll close out here with a couple examples of what these partnerships have looked like in other communities. Starting with one that Enterprise was involved with in the Pacific Northwest region, in close partnership with King County, Washington, as well as nonprofit partners and affordable housing developers. Enterprise launched the Home and Hope initiative to address the region's critical shortages of affordable housing and early learning centers. The Home and Hope initiative convened partners across sectors, really initially focused on just how to co-locate early learning centers and affordable housing. But the real magic was that it didn't stop there. The partnerships continued to grow and created a robust pipeline of development projects that not only met those needs, but really prompted systems level change. For instance, the initiative worked with public sector partners to identify public and tax exempt sites that could be designated for these uses in the future, and led to the creation of state and county grant programs to ensure funding for the new early learning centers, building in sustainability for the partnership over time. This next example really hones in on the power of effective shared outcomes. And this is really focused on Kansas City, Kansas, where the Kansas Department of Children and Families started by convening leaders of about 80 different agencies across Wyandotte County, which is home to Kansas City, to discuss community challenges. And following that meeting, started meeting across county level agencies and service providers to use an asset-based process for community development planning. And that really meant identifying and classifying community resources, looking at where strategic partnerships existed or could exist, and resulted in them really honing in on the key outcomes of alleviating student homelessness and increasing high school graduation rates. But they kept coming back to those over time. Chief executives from each sector involved would meet regularly with navigators that were running a one-stop resource center to support people experiencing homelessness and their children, and would continually check if they were meeting their targets, if they weren't, why, adjusting their process, and using that to really build public support for their efforts as they went. And then the last example I'll share is that funding piece, the all important, and how to really fund cross-sector work towards upward mobility. And this is an example from Minnesota called Homework Starts with Home, where the Minnesota Interagency Council on Homelessness was really able to draw statewide attention to the ways youth homelessness was impacting student mobility, attendance, and performance. This prompted the state commissioners of education and housing to work across agencies to unlock funding to address these issues. They directed housing resources, including the state's Housing Trust Fund and the Family Homeless Prevention and Assistance Program, to provide rental assistance and support services for families with school-aged children. And then they also used resources from the State Department of Education to create a 3-year grant program that supported local collaborations working to disrupt and prevent homelessness, while also improving school attendance and performance. So that was a fast run through 3 pretty amazing examples, but there's way more about those and more examples that can be shared. So I encourage you to check out this toolkit that Enterprise compiled based off of some of the work. You'll see Memphis highlighted in there if you go to this link, mobilitytoolkit.enterprise.org. For more examples of what these kind of partnerships for systems change across housing and education can look like, as well as tips, tools, and resources for implementing some of these lessons in your own work, in your own partnerships. So with that, I will stop sharing and pass things back to Austin, I believe.
Yes, thank you, Anne. Well, the first thing I'll say, I see we have a little over 50 participants here in this session. So this is the part our speakers did a really good job of making sure we had a lot of time to have a discussion with our participants. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off with one question that comes from the different discussions here. But I encourage a lot of our participants to either in the chat, or you'll also see the Q&A function, to post some questions in there. And for the rest of this time, it'll really just turn more into what we really like to do with the State of Housing Summit, just more of a good old-fashioned living room conversation. So to get that part of the session started, Roshana, I want to toss it to you first, because I think in doing the work you all have done in South Memphis, and then being seen and noticed for that work and brought to other neighborhoods and in the urban core and sort of in the heart of Memphis, what are some really key challenges and hard lessons learned in connecting that work at the household block, grassroots level that we can keep in mind as we start these conversations in Memphis around scaling that up citywide.
Well, Anne made me think of something, a statistic which is still sad today when you think about neighborhoods. And what I said at the law school last week was 75% of the neighborhoods that were redlined are low income today. 75% still remain. So this is a huge challenge. And although redlining is not supposedly it's a thing of the past, it really isn't. De facto, redlining still exists. And, so our Frazier property that we just completed a little over 10 months ago, our biggest challenge there was not that we didn't have enough low-income people in Memphis, so we have a really long waiting list even today with no units available. It was the unwillingness of banks to invest in that area, because what we know about being in the affordable housing world, there's never enough money to do the deal. And especially if we think about what's happening globally with supply chain issues and lumber prices increasing. So I say in development, sticks and bricks cost the same thing for me as they cost for anyone else. The difference in, like I don't get a discount on lumber, nor do I get a discount on the bricks. But I can't pass the cost on to my end user. I don't want to do that because they're very low income. We can only charge 1/3 of their gross income, and that's low. And so our rents are low. We're talking rents. We have rents, honestly, as low as $350. We don't have any units, so in case, but they range up to about $700. That's as far as we go, really, and that's a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. And so you can't make those deals really work. And so subsidy is a huge challenge. Very often it's policy. It's at a state level. Every year affordable housing developers, because I mentioned 80% of affordable housing is the multifamily in the low-income housing tax credit program. So we have something called the Qualified Allocation Plan. So we're fighting with the State Housing Finance Agency every year in how they make changes or no changes to the QAP, because what ends up, we talk about economic mobility, what ends up happening is you score better for certain types of projects, and those projects are in qualified census tracts. So just think of the lowest income census tract that you can have. That's where they want you to build. And so then, well, that hasn't worked for us since never, and so that's never worked. Well, we have a concentration of poverty, and we expect people to be have economic mobility, and for you to have good schools. If 75% of the neighborhoods that were redlined are still low income, then you don't have a lot of resources in those schools. And then now we're dealing with vacancy and blight. And so I started thinking about the tax revenue. How are schools funded? In Tennessee, for sure, they're funded through our property tax revenue. Well, if we're not generating any in certain areas, what do you think happens to the institutions that are very important in our community and are key in our mobility as citizens? And so that is a huge challenge. And then on a local level, at the policy level, our local bodies are very often not investing really in neighborhoods. And I say that because if you look at community development corporations and our history in Memphis, which is not as long as other areas across the country, probably none of us can say that we've received any incentive or any funding through our capital improvement process. And so again, sticks and bricks cost the same. Then our sewers and our infrastructure is crumbling. So it's like the encumbrances are put in our way. We don't get the discount on utilities if we're trying to infill. If we're trying to do infill, if we were building in a field in eastern side of Memphis, we get an affordable housing incentive. But the utility told me that the developer had already received this incentive in 1971, for instance. When I'm like, yeah, the year I was born, the developer, and I'm not that developer, but so we don't receive the incentives, but we have a negative deal. And then we can't get the debt financing in town. So there's an unwillingness of local banks to take what they consider risk, because I'm like, if I'm paying you back and my debt coverage ratio is like, 1.5, or actually we had one at 2.3, there's not a lot of risk to you. I'm taking the risk. We don't have a history of default. And so I just think on the housing side, people often think that we're just doing transactions, but it's not just the transaction, because there are real people at the end of this. And then there's a challenge of the people that we serve. They're very low income. And Jamilica mentioned mental health. And so we're having to deal with the traumas that they're experiencing in every other aspect of their life. Home is their safe place, as safe as they're going to get, probably. And so they come home and they bring that with them. And so part of our work in terms of challenges is we're having to be a lot of different things to the families that we serve. And I always say I play certain things on TV. So and I don't want to be it for real, but sometimes we have to be. And so you see us in the food space, and we're really in the food space because food costs so much. And if I am able to feed them and reduce their medication usage because we're teaching them how to eat healthier, then I have a better tenant. I look at Renaissance as still one of the things that I require is that we take some units offline to have a community space so we can sit and have a conversation, to have a computer center so that people that have a digital divide can have homework centers or even look for jobs. And then there's a fourth, outside of the leasing office, the fourth component is a clinic. And so where we bring in, medical professionals, both mental and physical health, because our populations in distressed neighborhoods are dying earlier, they're experiencing way more trauma. And it impacts, of course, if the adults are experiencing traumatic experiences, who gets it? The kids. And so it's just this vicious cycle. And so, we're trying to connect the dots. They want to fund us for housing, and then we have to use our housing developers fees to fund the rest of that we know that our families need. And, even going as far as a landlord, I think about last week, one of our property managers, the one in South Memphis, called and said, Mr. whatever I won't say his name, one of our tenants, he ran out of unemployment benefit. He doesn't have any job as, prospects. And he is waiting on rental assistance because it's such a great demand for the federal subsidy for rental assistance. We'll wait. We're not worried about his rent. We'll get that. But he needed food. She said he just needs grocery. And so what do I have to do? I have to call my staff person, who's our grocery manager, to say, take him grocery. And so he takes a picture of the grocery that he's sending. I'm like, well, put a little more meat, so I'm like distant, but I'm saying put a little more meat. He needs more produce. He needs more dairy. And, so he's a single male household, doesn't have a lot of access to other benefits. But then how do we help him determine whether he can get SNAP benefits? He was a working person. Everything went south. He lost his job. He was in hospitality. And so, we're dealing with those kind of things every day. And we don't necessarily want to be that, but we can't just walk away and turn our backs as a landlord or housing developer and say we're not going to address the other needs of those families. And so I like having a conversation about connecting the dots so that we tell practitioners in other areas or people that are experts, hey, this is what we need you to do. This is the reality for these families. And the housing people know way more than we'd like to know about a lot of families. I know the intimate details of a family's life because I provide them with housing. And so I'll stop for a moment. I don't know if I answered that, but I was thinking challenges is financing, is the traumatic experiences, is but not money is not always the center of it, but being able to connect policy, money, and the experiences of the people that we're serving. If we don't figure that out, it's just going to get worse.
Absolutely. And I think, Roshan, to say you answered it would be an understatement. I think what you also did as well, plus answering it, is show the need for at a systems level, right? I mean, you see what the Works is doing on the ground, having to play 5, 6, 7 different hats, having to cast ourselves in different TV roles to fill these different needs in people's lives. And so I think though the center of this, thinking about housing and education, that third component of this session, place, and the role of connecting just people-based needs. And so, Ann, I can't help, as Rashawn was talking, thinking about the work, the example you mentioned in Kansas City and Wyandotte County, where you had those service providers there. So it wasn't just the schools, but you also had the safety net providers, probably what the equivalent in Shelby County we call a community services agency. So what does that kind of look like? And you did a good job of touching on how housing and education are speaking different languages, but a lot of times you bring in service providers and you've got a whole nother glossary of alphabet soup that you have to kind of navigate with. So I'd love to hear a little bit about both that Kansas City example and just broader what that means to kind of bring those service providers in the conversation.
Sure. And it's such an important component, as you said. I mean, I think that is an area where consistently we hear, we think a lot about what brings people to the table, what's going to motivate somebody to really make the sacrifice to think in a different way, to operate in a different way. And so often when we are approaching school districts about, would you come to the table to discuss a housing and education partnership? The first question is, yes, if it helps my students get the services they need. And so having the services at the table and being able to really think about, how are people accessing those services right now? Where are the pitfalls, and how can schools really be a unifying force? And how can we match that on the services side and on the housing side to make it easier to translate across? So that's been a big focus across our efforts in working on technical assistance. In the Kansas City example, Enterprise was not even involved in. We just get to learn from their experiences. And I think that's something we've taken into some recent work happening outside of Denver, where we're working with the school district, with one of the school districts and the public housing authority, to really do a journey mapping of like, what does it feel like if you are a person whose children attend this school and you need housing assistance? What do you face? What information do you have and not have? Where is this feeling? Like, how is this feeling to people? Where is this creating more stress in an already stressful situation? And how do we find solutions that make it easier to access, make the process less challenging and stressful, and create just better connectivity across those kind of partners? Because I think that is one of the most immediate ways that people are seeing value out of bringing these kind of partnerships together. So I appreciate you lifting that up, Austin.
Yeah, and I think to that end, right, and on that note, I think as we transition from illuminating and making more awareness of the need, that the literal grassroots level, thinking about infrastructure and sidewalks and attaching water to developments, but also beginning to Jamilka, you mentioned in your intro presentation that you're beginning to start tying those conversations together and pulling in the different sectors, so we can have more citywide, countywide systems that make the work that the WorkSync and other community-based organizations on the ground are doing every day easier and more sustainable and more replicable, right, in a lot of ways. So Jamilka, what is that? What do those early successes look like in not only the Place Matters work, but also in some of the technical assistant provision and beginning to create this kind of framework for student-driven community development?
No, thank you for that question, Austin. It's definitely been very interesting, especially with the start of this work happening during the pandemic. There were some very quick things that needed to be done immediately that really helped to bring a lot of people to the table, especially at a time when there would be some individuals that, if it were not for the pandemic, would not potentially have been at the table. So capitalizing on the moment was really important as we had moved forward in this work. And one of the things that came out of this, that came in to be some of the early successes, with some of the investment and work that was taking place, we were able to work with a cross-sector partnership to really think strategically about, look, we have these initial funds, how can we immediately get it out to families and communities and organizations that are either being impacted by the pandemic or are helping to address some of their needs on the ground. So who would be those CDC, small organizations, maybe non-traditional organizations that typically do not receive that funding, but are critical into the success of making those connections to family over the last couple of years. And so being strategic from that standpoint, we were able to identify organizations in partnership with the Community Foundation and other philanthropic organizations here in the city to identify organizations, families that would benefit from that very quickly in a short period of time. That really helped to build the impetus of what it could look like to do that at scale, because as that work began, in addition to the pandemic, last year we were also going through our census and voter registration. So that was another opportunity to where, how can we have some near-term wins that have a significant impact that people can really connect to and understand to help move the work forward. So what that has looked like recently is that as that work has started to take place, people were beginning to talk more, to have more dialogue about, well, as we're doing this work, what does it look like to now start doing this long term? Because if you're talking about change, increasing mobility, that's not a 1 or 2 year activity. You're talking about the next 10, 15, 20 years. So what does it look like to build an infrastructure, starting with what we already have in place, understanding what's taking place in many of our key communities, understanding who are the key players, and not just your traditional, the usual go-to players, but who are those community members that also have a footprint in the communities that can help to build out and think through what those infrastructures should look like and how they should be. And coupling that with some of the work that has already been beginning to be more focused around the discussion of we're having the housing and education, what we were able to do in partnership with Enterprise was really start to look at some of those data at the neighborhood, build and look on current plans like Memphis 3.0 and others to know, well, where is there already existing infrastructure, having partnership with the school systems to understand where are your students with greatest need, highest mobility in terms of moving. And how can we start to think strategically about how can we start connecting the dots between what's taking place in the school and what's taking place in the communities in which they serve so that we're able to bring those resources into a safe place, because that's also important, the trust in a relationship, because it's more than just bringing resource to the table, but also who's the best messenger to bring that work. And what we also found is that many times it could be people within their school, individuals within their community that can help make that connection. So that's been a lot of the early wins in terms of like looking at what's happening at the ground. And what we're looking at doing as we're scaling that work is Memphis does not have a lot of community schools, which is more of that full service model of bringing all services and supports into the school building to help support families and children. So what we're looking at is using that model, how can we do a pilot in 3 or 4 of these key neighborhoods that we're discussing to say, if we're going to use the school as a hub, what does it then look like to bring in understand from the families what their priority needs are? How can we start to bring the right partners into the building to support that? And then have that coordination of effort and understanding in terms of who's receiving what. And this also aligns with other pieces of work in terms of not just looking at what the school resources are, but also what our other partners can bring to the table within that. And what has really been the linchpin, and a lot of that is really identifying strong individuals to be that connector within the school that can help bring all those different pieces together. So as we're looking at bringing more of that together and scaling that, what we're doing right now in these 3 or 4 communities is starting to understand how can this work? What systems need to be in place? How are we able to track progress? And by doing that, it gives us kind of a roadmap of then how would it look to do this across our community at scale? And so it would be done over the next 2 or 3 years. And this would be a lot of great information, data, and research to help drive what strategies we need to see. Because we also talked, and Rashawn mentioned this as well, is that for the sustainability of this work is more than resources, but many times it's policy change and understanding what are the barriers to making those connections. And so as we're moving forward in this work to really make those connections, build the case. It's also helping to understand what are those specific barriers that we have to address from either what I call a small P or big P policy in order to move the work forward so that ultimately we are improving mobility for our kids and families in our communities.
I like that a lot. Yeah, the small P and big P. I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And to that point, I wanted, Rashawn, you mentioned as a housing developer, you're uniquely and intimately involved in sort of the lives of the folks that the holistic lives and the restoration of the folks that you work with. And so I think when a lot of times we, again, talk about connecting the dots and the connections between housing and education, do you have a couple of examples or can you think of some specific ways that manifests itself at the people level, right? At like the human level, what the disconnection between housing and education, and sort of to reinstate sort of the why, right? Why at a big level we need to connect these dots more specifically.
Oh, that's a hard one. Hard question for me from the people level, because I guess we never really have those discussions about the disconnect uh, between housing and education. I mean, I guess, I can't assume that educational institutions, because of all of the things that the administrators and teachers have to deal with, understand the requirements for families once they're seeking housing. I think about that. We try to, in some instances, but it's been very one-off because we also can't take on the challenges of education, and we don't know enough about what happens inside of the school. But I just think about examples of a school partnering with us or attempting to partner with us, and they have a parent or 10 parents that need housing. Most of the time, we don't have anything available. That's first. And we don't really do emergency housing, because that's most often what we see when another institution from another sector calls us. They need it now. And I'm like, so yeah, we're not that agency. And there are probably not many agencies in Memphis that have emergency housing available because we have such a crisis. But Jamilka kind of mentioned it, the connectors, so that those connectors have a knowledge of how housing works. How do we determine when people are eligible to be in our housing, what we're looking for? Not that they have to pull the credit in the background check, but at least give that information. Because one thing I have my staff do is talk to parents or whatever family comes in, and give them some advanced knowledge prior to us pulling any type of background. So I get them to tell us about themselves, and I need them to be honest, because there are instances where we can assist them even if they have something that our investors don't like to see, because we have to abide by some rules depending on who invests in us. We have some housing where we have more flexibility, but it's there are barriers between the sectors because we don't know what they do. We don't have time for it, don't want to do it. And then they don't know what we do, but we could help families potentially outside of the schools and keep them at a school. I've gotten a lot of emergency calls from school leaders and principals to say, we want this family to stay in the school, but they don't have a transportation. And if they don't find housing in this area, they're not going to be able to stay here. And I'm like, I'm sorry, I just can't help you because we don't have anything available. And so it's the connectors. I walked in the office today and I thought about, because our apartments are here too. And the lady, they walked up to me, she was looking for one of my staff people. And I was like, why? She's no longer here. What do you need? And it was about, she was the food programs person, but the lady wanted to talk about the utility bill. And I was like, well, why would she know that anyway? But, and so it's helping a person that connect those dots. They know enough about the housing industry, and they also know how to interact with families in school, because it's a trust issue also. And the passing of their family's information between agencies, that family needs to trust the school or or whatever entity, and they need to trust the housing entity. And I know I don't think I answered that, because I don't really honestly have a real answer outside of going back to needing connectors that are trusted partners to the school, the housing agency, and the family.
Yeah, no, I'll be totally honest. I think that question actually turned out much better than when I was even asking it. I thought it would, because it established this through line, right? I mean, because we ended, as we wrap up here in our last minute or two, we ended coming back to something that was mentioned at the beginning and throughout, right? This importance of trust and building trust between both the people that we're working with on the ground that are living the realities of this disconnection, as well as institutions and funders and partners and into the Place Matters work, and building trust between the community and a participatory process and a community-driven process. So again, couldn't have scripted that any better. That was perfect. And I will just thank everyone as we wrap up here in our last minute. I thank all of you for joining us in this very enlightening, amazing discussion. I really appreciate it. Thank you to Ms. Tanya Johnson for the introductions. Thank you to all three of our panelists for really having, I'm maybe a little biased, but what I think was one of the most rich and content-rich and detailed discussions of the day. So for those of you that are interested in staying on, we have one more session. Thank you for hanging in with us throughout the day. We'll wrap up at 3 o'clock with a closing conversation with Dr. Prentice Danzler from the University of Toronto and Lord S. German, a fellow at Kresge Foundation. Again, discussing, it's a great complement to our conversation here because we landed on funding as a key challenge. And now with unprecedented federal investment in cities at the city level, through a number of different funding streams, how can we use that to apply to this disconnect and to create some of these more systemic connections of dots between housing, education, and place. So I hope you all will come back and join us after a 15-minute social networking break. Thank you again. Big thank you to the panelists. Really appreciate it. You all have a good day.